Those who first attempted to deviate from these old customs were regarded as putting on airs and were treated with contempt. But time has been hard on the customs. The automobile, the telephone, the radio leave people no time to spend on elaborate ceremonial. The old-time ceilidh, too, has gone the ways of the other customs, and with it the old tales that enlivened many a long winter's evening. No longer do seers startle their friends by the recital of their visions. The honk of the automobile has frightened away the bochtan, and the glare of its lights have dulled the vision of the sights of the other world. Music floods the air, but is heard only with mechanical aid. Yet there are still, in the little province by the sea, a few secluded spots unspoiled by modern inventions, where the otherworldliness of the Celt may disport itself in visions and in dreams. Hello. My name is Ian, and today we're talking about Mary Fraser's Folklore of Nova Scotia, and we're talking a little bit about an introduction I wrote to a reprint of it a couple of years ago. It's an interesting collection, this work. Mary Fraser was born just outside of Antigonish. She got her BA and her MA at St. Francis Xavier, at which point she had already entered into the congregation of Notre Dame as a nun. She then went to Fordham, the Jesuit University in New York City, and she studied under Father Monaghan. Monaghan was an interesting social justice person. He was a basis for some of the priests one of the priests on the waterfront. So, was interested in dock workers and labor rights and so on. She then went back to St. FX, and eventually she became the head of Mount St. Bernard, which was the women's college of St. FX before the university sort of amalgamated. But basically, it was the sister college, and she was there for basically her entire life. Sister St. Thomas of the Angels was her official nun name. I'm sure there's probably a better word for it than a nun name, but that's what she was. And this book started as her PhD thesis that she did at Fordham under Father Monaghan, who, there's very little paper record apart from the manuscript itself about what made her choose this topic. So this would have been like the late 1920s when she was doing the PhD. And let's be clear, from the title, Folklore of Nova Scotia, this is basically the folklore of the eastern part of the mainland and the western part of Cape Breton. There are hints here and there outside, but for the most part, it's the study of Catholic Scots of this particular area. Basically, it's the study of her home community, which is fine. It's not representative of all of Nova Scotia by any stretch, but neither was Arthur Huff Fawcett's Folklore from Nova Scotia, which was basically published in the same year, which was African Nova Scotian community. But still, it is absent. It is absent almost any discussion of the English, except as foe or foil, at least. No real discussion of the Irish. No real discussion. Some discussion of the Acadians, but not much. No real discussion of the German population. Absolutely no discussion of the African Nova Scotian population. And a very fraught and problematic discussion of First Nations. Maybe we could even dive right in there. Just going by the first three chapters, her introduction, and then her, what does she call that actual title, that chapter? Indian Myth and Legend, and then finally over to Popular Superstitions, which is basically when she starts talking about the Celts. So just going on those first three chapters alone. It's interesting in her history of Nova Scotia, because it's not, as a pool of data, it's not a bad history. and it gives most of the thrusts, but it is certainly situated. The idea of a land and its peoples basically starting with, Vikings and their tentative forays, and the various sort of hints in what we might call sort of fundamentally legend, or at least the reconstruction prior to some kind of written history. And then, what was the term she uses eventually? Authentic history begins for Nova Scotia in 1604 with the coming of de Monts and his company. So authentic history starts in 1604. Basically, she's describing an empty landscape. Incidentally, in that chapter, she does start referring to their encounters with the Mi'kmaq, but only the Mi'kmaq are very passive agents in this section. In the second chapter, she does talk, when she talks about, again, using the word Indian, myth, and legend, she talks about the original inhabitants of Nova Scotia were the Mi'kmaq Indians. They belonged originally to the confederations of Eastern Algonquins, among whom they held third place in the distribution of lands. So it is a fascinating, somewhat revisionist history, but important to her is, of crucial importance to her, is the discussion of. I'm hopping back and forth a little bit, but the important discussion to her is the discussion of the conversion to Catholicism, and that fundamentally once they were converted and became very devout Catholics, which is true to this day, very, very, in some ways very conservative, although an interestingly syncretic Catholicism among Mi'kmaq people. All of a sudden, they were cool. But then for the rest of the book, fundamentally, once they've been dealt with in this chapter, they drop out entirely, and they are absent yet again. Going back to that history chapter, she talks about French settlement. She talks about Acadia, the Acadian expulsion. She talks about the Loyalists. She talks a little bit about the Germans coming. And then fundamentally she talks about the Scots and like the good ship Hector and all the touchstones of Scottishness, how the original, the first wave tended to be Presbyterian, but then fundamentally Scottish Catholics. And that's who she sticks with for the rest of the book, really. And in part that's because of the sources that she's using. She is going from popular tradition. And popular tradition is in quotes throughout. She just ascribes things to popular tradition. Sometimes she has some kind of direct provenance, like I got this from Father Cameron's very own brother. And sometimes she deliberately obscures, so it just gives Alex Mac Dash, which seems to suggest that the narrative, and that certainly when she's, because most of the things that she is talking about are beliefs. I mean, for her, the folklore is almost exclusively the belief, its manifestation in practice, i.e. superstitions and foretellings, and how those superstitions and foretellings and being able to prognosticate are evidenced through stories. So how they became, she collects the evidence of supernatural traditions through narrative. Legends that are not necessarily about practice, but anomaly. So the devil at the crossroads, and then the devil on the road, and a whole bunch of stories having to do with the devil treading the land. She doesn't talk a huge amount about Märchen. She doesn't talk a huge amount about oral history. It's basically a collection of superstitions. What is more, she seems to have some kind of disparagement. It's a very strange thing that she locates. And again, at the beginning of chapter 3, when she talks about the popular superstitions, The superstitions of a race represent the religious beliefs of ancient peoples. They are exaggerated fear of the unknown. Religious superstition marks a degeneracy in religion and is very rare among the Celts. And who does she cite for that but her own professor, who is apparently giving a lecture about folklore? For whatever reason, who knows, at a theological institution, and an excellent theological institution like Fordham, who knows why a social justice priest was nevertheless talking about folklore. Our Nova Scotian superstitions come under good and bad luck, cures for man and beast, the influence of the moon, and so like. It is practically impossible to discover in the case of some of these practices which are importations from the old country and which those of native growth. In any case, they are here and have been here for more than a century, although their origin is wrapped in obscurity. So she, oddly enough, despite the fact that this book is fundamentally a celebration of the most part of vernacular belief that is independent of religious belief, and therefore a sign of degeneracy, which she sees as anomalous among the Celts, and she clearly understands the people that she is talking about first and foremost as the Celts in North America and not really their own thing. I can't quite wrestle with that ambiguity. I can't quite wrestle with this is a sign of some kind of holdover from some pagan past. Again, degenerate past, while simultaneously being something that is worthy of collecting an entire book for. Because, as I said, that quote that I read at the very beginning is the very last paragraph of the book that is basically lamenting the fact that these things are disappearing, that modernity is coming in. It's this anti-modernism idea, this notion that the contemporary world is somehow lacking in authenticity, lacking in moral fiber, lacking in value, and that what one needs is a place, again using her words, in the little province by the sea, a few secluded spots unspoiled by modern inventions, that there are places where these things are still around and we can turn to them. We being the indeterminate North American, we being the indeterminate North American Celt. So as she was studying under the Irish Americans at Fordham, like Monaghan, maybe she was just sort of suggesting, and again, the sort of pan-Celticism that, oh yeah, well, we have this kind of stuff where I grew up. And yes, it is in stark contrast to the modern. It's in stark contrast to the docks at outside the docks of New York City, and the longshoremen who work there. So it's this very ambiguous, descriptive, decontextualized piece of work. There's these two moments to consider, because this shouldn't necessarily be surprising if you've been studying how folklore was adapted and to what use it was being used in the late 19th and early 20th century. And that it really was this push against the modern. It was this idea that the authentic lay somewhere among the people who were less influenced by the modern. That what was real, what really spoke to the spirit of a people, was the customs and the practices that were still inhabited and still thriving among people who were not urban. I mean, it really is a pushback. It is also romantic, because as one is collecting from at this point in time, if you're looking at it through this lens, then anything that strikes one as being modern, being of the contemporary, is seen as an unfortunate dilution of this pool that we were hoping to keep clean, or we were hoping was clean, of this bad influence of modernity. So, and that's how you were going to put on your collecting spectacles and go out. You'll be selective in how you collect. Anything that smacks of the modern, you're probably going to let go. Anything that smacks of very syncretic, you might start to let go. So, I mean, again, we have to cut her some slack. She was a nun associated with a congregation. She wouldn't necessarily have a huge amount of liberty. I mean, certainly a lot of status and esteem, but not necessarily a huge amount of personal liberty to go and do deep collecting exercises in the same way that we would in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But she wasn't collecting in any of the sort of the industrial areas. She could have gone to Truro. She could have gone to Pictou in New Glasgow, and she could have been in the industrial areas there. She's not collecting much. I mean, she mentions the mines every now and then. But she's not collecting among coal miners. She's not collecting among steel workers. She's not collecting among people who are working in the various factories that peppered Nova Scotia at this time. It's basically this idealized pastoral community that was still present but didn't define place. And certainly not in its entirety didn't define place. One thing we also want to make clear is that folklore collection has often been in this gray area, hovering between the professional and the amateur. And the professional folklorist is someone who, in theory, at the very least, in theory has academic training, has a theoretical perspective, has the weight of an institution behind them, some kind of imprimatur in terms of an academic or an intellectual tradition, is associated perhaps with an institution like a university, like a museum, like an institution, like the Library of Congress, like the National Library or the National Museums in Ottawa. And then we have the amateur. And the amateur does not have that. And so much of our collecting has been, so much of the point that I am trying to make is that this idea of professionalization as being inherently superior to the work that is done by the amateur is part of a very ugly elitist legacy that we have in Canada, in Atlantic Canada, in North America, and in general. Because the amateur, which has this connotation, I mean, clearly, almost by definition, it has this connotation of not being professional, but therefore it has this connotation of being less than competent. It has this connotation of being illegitimate somehow. But we have people who in their communities understand the community, understand the context. Sometimes, perhaps, they are doing it somewhat romantically, but they can do it exhaustively. They can do it, they can be aware of proper collecting methods, and they can be quite inspiring in that which they collect. And really the issue is that their questions aren't always going to be the same questions as the professional. The professional might be having some kind of more holistic approach in terms of much more interested in comparison, or much more interested in various forms of analysis. And it's okay that the professional has that question, but it's also okay that the amateur doesn't. And in fact, sometimes that's of a benefit, because if the professional is really more than anything fascinated with the idea of comparison and using it in some kind of like a intercultural analysis, they start to neglect the local. And so the amateur, again, an unfortunate term, or at least a term that has occasionally undeserved denotations and connotations. The amateur has been reintegrated into the study of folklore as having a wealth of experience, a network of collaborators, a deep and, of course, inhabited understanding of the community in which this material arises. So we can look at Mary Fraser, Sister St. Thomas of the Angels, within that sort of, she's kind of on the cusp between the two, because clearly she was doing it. I mean, she was doing it as her PhD thesis, and she published it with footnotes, and she published it with the beginnings of some kind of theory. She wasn't a graduate of an anthropology program or something that was actually doing much in terms of folklore. She had a couple of standard references, and that was about it. She has some spurious theory in there in the chapter on the First Nations, where she takes the two stories that seem to be very similar to each other, and that's an interesting beginning of comparison. But her conclusion is basically that maybe there's some kind of shared origin, with a Bering Strait hypothesis, and that's how the Scot and the Mi'kmaq ended up with basically the same story, as if communities that have been in contact for, the First Nations community being in contact by this time with Europeans for the better part of 300 years, the idea that they might have taken a story and brought it into their own community, that would shatter her idea of these sort of traditions as being whole and siloed and pure. But as a way of reflecting the concerns that were of her community, and yes, partly of her community or her role and status as an educator and as a religious in Nova Scotia, but also as a let's use the adjective that I don't like using too often, proud Scottish Catholic of Eastern Nova Scotia. She brings an understanding to it that can't be dismissed out of hand. So Folklore of Nova Scotia is a really interesting book. It is available in this handy reprint from a couple of years ago with my introduction in it. I don't get a dime from it, so feel free to buy it or not. It's in the public domain, so it's available online. The original publication is available all over the place online. You don't even have to go to the dark web in order to pick it up. And it's an interesting snapshot of not only a culture, but of a particular moment in the history of folklore study that we can pay attention to, and we can have get some real insights from. It's problematic. Some of it is just, every now and then there's just some outright racist stuff that you have to go, oh no. Sometimes it's remarkably sympathetic. Sometimes it's remarkably modern. And sometimes it's just simply a product of its age. And as much as that's a weak sauce excuse, we need to go with it. All right. That's all I have to say. My name is Ian. Today we've been talking about Mary Fraser's Folklore of Nova Scotia. As ever, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well, my friends. Bye-bye.